On June 15, 2014, 30-year-old Seattle resident Jenna Roberts disappeared without a trace right after dinner with a client. 7 years later, technicians called out for a sewage backup, discovered a door hidden behind a massive shelving unit in the basement of a building. In the secret room, they found an emaciated woman who had spent more than 2,500 days in complete isolation. You will find out exactly who turned this basement into a concrete prison and how the kidnapper managed to remain undetected for years. The events in this story are presented as a narrative interpretation. Some elements have been altered or recreated for storytelling purposes. On June 15, 2014, Seattle was under the sway of low gray clouds that promised a lingering overnight downpour. 30-year-old Jenna Roberts lived in a small rented apartment in the Belltown neighborhood, where every square foot of space cost more than she could afford. Her path to this city was difficult. After moving from another state, she faced serious financial difficulties, which eventually forced her to choose the escort industry. Her closest friend, 29-year-old Lydia Simons, later described Jenna as a person with extreme internal discipline and a keen sense of danger. Lydia claimed during interrogations that Jenna never drank alcohol at meetings and always had a charged phone in her hand. However, in the last few months before her disappearance, her life had become a constant game of survival because of 33-year-old Dylan Scott. This man was a regular customer whose affection quickly turned into an unhealthy obsession. According to Lydia, Scott tried to control every aspect of Jenna's personal life, bombarding her with messages and demanding reports on every hour she spent with him. On June 15, 2014, at 7 o'clock in the evening, Jenna arrived at a restaurant called the Silver Harbor, where she had an appointment with Dylan. Witnesses who worked at the restaurant that evening recalled that the woman looked extremely exhausted and emotionally distressed. The atmosphere at their table was heavy. Scott spoke in a low, monotone voice, hardly taking his eyes off Jenna, while she nervously twirled a thin gold ring on her finger. At 8 o'clock, 20 minutes in the evening, Jenna received a text message on her cell phone. A waiter who was passing by at the time noticed that after reading the text, the woman froze for a moment and her face turned an ashen hue. She didn't say a word, but stood up abruptly, grabbed her purse, and almost ran out of the restaurant, leaving Scott sitting there with his dinner untouched. The investigative team later reconstructed her route in detail using surveillance footage. The grainy footage showed Jenna covering a distance of 2 miles in a fast, almost feverish pace toward her apartment complex. She kept looking over her shoulder as if she could feel someone's eyes on her back. At 8 o'clock 45 in the evening, the camera at the intersection near the Old City Park captured her for the last time. Jenna was only 300 yards from her driveway. The next morning, June 16th, Lydia Simons felt the first stab of panic when Jenna didn't answer the traditional 9 o'clock call. The friends had an agreement to get in touch every morning to confirm their safety. When Jenna's phone was still out of range by 10 o'clock, Lydia went to her house. She found the apartment door locked and the place dead silent. The Seattle police who were called initially refused to take the case seriously, suggesting that the 30-year-old woman could have simply left town of her own accord. However, Lydia insisted on a search, which eventually showed that there was nothing in the apartment to indicate that she was preparing to leave. There were car keys on the kitchen table and fresh food in the refrigerator. The first suspect was Dylan Scott. During the interrogation, he behaved aggressively, claiming that they had parted ways near the restaurant and he had no idea of her further whereabouts. Investigators checked his alibi and found that at 9 o'clock 20 minutes in the evening, he was captured on camera at a gas station 10 miles from Jenna's home. His car was thoroughly examined by forensic experts, but no biological traces or signs of a struggle were found. The search operations lasted more than 3 weeks. Volunteers and law enforcement combed every mile of coastal area and parkland, but Seattle seemed to swallow the woman whole. Jenna's phone beeped for the last time at 8 o'clock 52 minutes in the evening that day, and then went silent forever. The absence of any evidence, lost shoes, jewelry, or signs of a struggle, left detectives stumped. Over the next 7 years, the Jenna Roberts case gradually disappeared from the front pages of newspapers, turning into another folder in the archive of unsolved crimes. Lydia Simmons continued to send messages to her friend's disconnected number, refusing to believe that she was dead. For the police and the city, Jenna became a ghost, a statistical unit in the list of missing persons whose life was cut short a few steps from the doorstep of her own home on June 15, 2014. Each new year only deepened the abyss of uncertainty, leaving her loved ones in a state of oppressive silence that stretched for thousands of sleepless nights. For 7 years, Jenna Roberts' case remained a motionless archive in the Seattle Police Department, gradually moving from the category of active investigations to the category of so-called cold cases that had almost no chance of a successful resolution. The life of the big city went on. The video surveillance cameras on the streets were replaced with more modern models, and witnesses lost the clarity of their memories over time. But for Lydia Simmons, every new day was a reminder of an unhealed wound and thousands of unanswered questions she asked to the void in the hope of hearing at least a hint of the truth. All that changed in May of 2021 when an unusually sunny and dry spring in Washington state suddenly changed its character, giving way to a period of prolonged and extremely intense rainstorms that overwhelmed the city's drainage systems and forced sewage to seek an outlet in the weakest points of private household infrastructure. The owners of a private 2-story house on the remote northern outskirts of Seattle, who had been living in another state for the past 8 years due to their professional activities, decided to finally return to the city to check on the condition of their property before putting it up for sale. According to their later testimony to the investigation, the house had been under the supervision of a remote security firm all this time, but none of the owners had ever entered the house in all these years, trusting the appearance of the building and the automatic reports of the security systems, which did not record unauthorized entry through doors or windows. On May 17, 2021, the owners discovered a serious problem. Due to excessive rainfall, the old sewage system in the basement of the building had failed, threatening to flood the foundation and damage the structures of the entire building. The next day, May 18, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 technicians from a private service company arrived on an emergency call. According to one of them, 34-year-old Mark Evans, they went down to the basement, which at first glance looked quite ordinary. Cold concrete walls cluttered with old cardboard boxes, leftover building materials, and several heavy wooden shelves for garden tools. However, during a detailed inspection of the sewage pipes in the farthest corner of the basement, the technicians noticed a strange architectural detail. One of the walls, completely covered with a massive wooden shelving unit, did not match the official building plan they had digitally available on their tablet. When Mark tried to push the heavy wooden structure aside, he realized that the shelving was not just standing on the floor, but was firmly attached to powerful hidden metal hinges and actually served as part of a cleverly disguised door. Behind this door was another obstacle, a steel partition with a heavy padlock that could be opened only from the outside, and a slight air movement was felt around the metal frame, indicating the presence of a forced ventilation system. When the door was eventually opened with the help of special hydraulic tools, the technicians were overwhelmed by a heavy, specific smell of old moisture, antiseptics, and a person's long stay in a closed space without access to fresh air. Inside, in a small isolated room about 12 by 12 feet, under the dim light of a single lamp, they saw a motionless human figure. An emaciated woman in worn, dirty clothes sat on an iron bed, chained to the frame by a thin but extremely strong metal cable by the ankle. Her skin was almost transparent, unnaturally white from years of lack of sunlight, and her eyes squinted painfully from the bright beam of the technician's flashlight. The workers immediately called the 911 service, and within 15 minutes, the building was surrounded by patrol cars and ambulances. 11 o'clock 45 minutes in the morning of May 18, 2021, was the moment when the 7-year search for Jenna Roberts officially ended. As paramedics carefully carried her on a stretcher to a car, neighbors saw only an emaciated female silhouette tightly covered with a thermal blanket. The Seattle police identified the body as the same 30-year-old woman who disappeared on June 15, 2014. She had been in custody for over 2,560 days, held in complete isolation just 3 miles from her former home. The official report of the detectives stated that the secret room was equipped with basic amenities, including a small metal sink, a primitive off-grid water supply system, and a makeshift toilet, which was improperly operated and led to the accident. Jenna's physical condition was critical. Doctors diagnosed an extreme degree of exhaustion and serious atrophy of the muscles in her legs. For Lydia Simons, the news that Jenna was alive came as a real emotional shock, but the realization that her friend had been suffering right next to her all this time caused her paralyzing horror. The police immediately began examining the list of all the people who could have had keys to the house over the past 7 years, as the owners had provided ironclad proof of their stay in another state. Every inch of the secret room was documented by forensic scientists. There were charcoal drawings on the concrete floor and hundreds of small dashes scratched into one of the walls, which Jenna used to count the years of her captivity. The walls of the room were covered with a thick layer of soundproof foam, which explained why no one had ever heard her screams. This discovery turned a forgotten case into the state's highest-profile crime, attracting the best detectives. The realization that Jenna Roberts had lived in this concrete square for 2,560 days was the beginning of a new, even darker stage of the investigation, where every object found in the basement was to become a key to the identity of the person who had turned the woman's life into an endless nightmare in broad daylight. Immediately after Jenna Roberts was taken from the basement of her home on the northern outskirts of Seattle, her life became a struggle for every minute of physical and mental stability. An ambulance with sirens blaring took her to Harborview Medical Center, where an intensive care team and leading trauma specialists were waiting for her. According to the medical report, which later became part of the criminal case file, Jenna's physical condition at the time of hospitalization was critical and bordering on life-threatening. At 5 feet and 4 inches tall, she weighed less than 80 pounds, indicating an extreme degree of long-term malnutrition and nutritional dystrophy. The woman's skin had an unnatural grayish-white, almost pearly hue, typical of people who have not seen direct sunlight for years, and the muscles in her legs had almost completely atrophied due to the inability to move properly in a confined space of only 120 square feet. The doctors noted in their reports that any sudden movement, bright light, or loud sound caused the patient to have instant panic attacks, accompanied by convulsive shaking of the whole body. But she did not make a sound, even when she was given drips. Jenna Roberts' psychological state became the main barrier to the investigation. She was in a state of deep dissociative stupor, staring at one point on the wall for hours and completely ignoring any attempts at contact from medical personnel. For Seattle Police Major Crimes detectives, this meant that the most important source of information, the victim herself, would remain indefinitely inaccessible behind the wall of her traumatic silence. Meanwhile, another group of law enforcement officers began intensive work with the owners of the house where the secret prison was found. They were an elderly woman, 72-year-old Martha Higgins, and her 45-year-old son, Edward. Police reports noted that during the first interrogation, both appeared confused and genuinely frightened, categorically denying any involvement in the kidnapping or illegal detention of a person. It was found that for the past 10 years, Martha and Edward had been living in Portland, Oregon, where Edward worked as a manager in the field of large-scale logistics. Investigators returned to the house on the outskirts of the city, turning the basement into a full-fledged crime lab. The expert's report indicated that the secret room was almost surgically clean, except for the places where dirty water had entered due to a recent sewer break. This indicated that the kidnapper was extremely careful, methodical, and probably had professional training or a pathological penchant for perfect order. On the concrete floor beneath the thin mattress, forensic scientists found traces of bleach, which the attacker had apparently regularly treated all surfaces with to completely eliminate biological traces and odors. Lydia Simons, who spent 8 hours a day in the cold hospital corridor, later recalled in conversations with the press that she felt physical pain from the silence coming from her friend's room. Jenna was only a few yards away, behind a wall of sterile medical boxes, but mentally she was still in that dark basement, trapped in her own memories. Every attempt Lydia made to give her friend even a short note or her former favorite flowers was met with a strict prohibition from her treating doctors. Any sharp reminder of her past life could provoke an irreversible mental breakdown. The Seattle police, deprived of the opportunity to obtain testimony from the victim himself, focused on a detailed study of the technical aspects of the building. It was found that the electricity to the basement room was connected bypassing the main meters in the building using a complex system of jumpers and hidden wiring, which required specific professional knowledge in the field of electrical engineering. The hijacker acted like an invisible ghost. He had been using someone else's house as his own for years, knowing the owner's schedule and all the vulnerabilities in the building's security system. The more small details the investigators had at their disposal, the clearer and more terrifying the psychological profile of the criminal became. This was a man who not only wanted to possess Jenna, but also wanted to create an isolated parallel reality for her, where time and space belonged to him alone. But as long as Jenna Roberts maintained her heavy silence, the walls of Harborview Hospital remained the last line of defense between the woman and the world that demanded the truth from her, which she was not yet ready for, either physically or mentally. Every hour of waiting undermined the detectives' confidence in the success of the investigation, because without the testimony of the main victim, they were dealing only with an empty concrete box and the shadow of a person who turned out to be much more cunning than all those who searched for her during these long 7 years of obscurity. Friends, before we continue to dive into the details of this gruesome case, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and like this video. YouTube's algorithms work in such a way that your activity helps to promote this content, so that Jenna Roberts' story can be seen by many more people. This is extremely important for the development of the channel, so thank you all for your support. While Jenna Roberts was under round-the-clock medical care in a sterile box at Harborview Hospital, the Seattle Police Department's investigative team began an extensive, detailed examination of the facility that had served as a prison for the 30-year-old woman for 7 years. The detectives' first priority was to finally verify the testimony of the homeowners, 72-year-old Martha Higgins and her 45-year-old son, Edward, whose alibi seemed too perfect at first glance. However, after a thorough analysis of bank transactions, tax reports, and work schedules from another state, doubts began to dissipate. The investigation received official confirmation that Edward Higgins had never left Portland for more than 12 hours in the past 10 years, and his mother had hardly left her residential neighborhood due to her health. The owners could not physically be involved in the daily maintenance of a person in another city hundreds of miles away from their actual place of residence. This meant that the real kidnapper acted as a shadow, using the abandoned property as a cover for his crime for 2,500 days. Forensic scientists dressed in white hazmat suits examined the 144-square-foot secret room inch by inch. The room was filled with items that told the story of a 7-year imprisonment: worn, yellowed clothing, several old mattresses stacked on top of each other for minimal comfort, and numerous empty canned food and bottled water containers. However, The decisive piece of evidence was found in the darkest corner of the room, behind a massive steel door, where a bit of trash had accumulated that the water from the faulty sewage system had not had time to flush out. It was a small paper bag with the logo of the Silver Harbor restaurant, the very place where Jenna was last seen with Dylan Scott on June 15, 2014. The package clearly bore an ink stamp with the date and time of the order, which indicated May 13, 2021. This meant that the purchase had been made just 5 days before the technicians opened the disguised entrance. This discovery instantly changed the vector of the investigation, again focusing the detectives' attention on the figure of Dylan Scott. The connection to the restaurant that was involved in the case 7 years ago could not be a coincidence. The investigation suggested that Scott could not only have been following Jenna, but had planned her abduction in detail, staging her departure in front of CCTV cameras. The detectives assumed that after Jenna left the restaurant in a panic, he could have caught up with her on a dark stretch of road near her home, forced her into a car, and taken her to a prearranged location. During the re-examination of the case file, it turned out that Dylan Scott had some experience in construction work, which explained the presence of professional soundproofing and a skillfully disguised door in the basement. The police began active preparations for Scott's re-interrogation, considering his morbid obsession and attempts to control Jenna's personal life as the main motive for keeping the victim in isolation for so long. Every detail of the found package, every print on the paper, was now being studied under a microscope, as this piece of paper became the first real bridge between the night of the disappearance and today. As forensic scientists continued to recover physical evidence, including old mattresses and food scraps, the atmosphere at the Seattle Police Department grew increasingly tense. Everyone realized that they were dealing with a man who had shown extraordinary patience and cold calculation, living a double life for years just a few miles from his own home. The detectives hoped that a repeat visit to Dylan Scott with new evidence would force him to finally make a mistake that would break the walls of silence in this case. For Lydia Simons, each new news from the police station was another step into the unknown, as the realization that the kidnapper could be very close by and even visit the restaurant where she often went caused her a deep sense of insecurity. The investigation continued to put together a puzzle where every detail in the shadows of the basement indicated that the ending of this story would be much more complicated and gloomy than anyone could have imagined 7 years ago when the search was just beginning. On May 22, 2021, the Seattle Police Department's investigative team entered a phase of open confrontation with the man who had been the focus of their attention for the past 7 years, 33-year-old Dylan Scott. Based on the paper bag from the Silver Harbor restaurant found in the basement, which was freshly stamped on May 13th, the detectives conducted a second interrogation that far exceeded all previous interviews in terms of its emotional intensity. According to the official protocol, Scott behaved extremely aggressively. His tone was harsh, and his gestures were jerky and nervous. When he was presented with evidence from the restaurant where he had last dined with Jenna before her disappearance on June 15, 2014, the man turned to direct accusations against the police. According to the detectives present in room 4, Scott stated that he did not intend to say another word without his lawyer, as he believed he was the victim of systematic harassment and psychological pressure that had been going on for years. Such a defensive stance and open hostility only strengthened the suspicions of the investigation. Law enforcement officials interpreted his aggression as an attempt to hide his panic in the face of obvious evidence. However, the legal side of the case turned out to be much more complicated. Despite the presence of a package from the same restaurant, the police were unable to establish a direct physical connection between Dylan Scott and the abandoned house on the northern outskirts of the city, where Jenna was found in a secret room in the basement. A check of rental records, tax returns, and cell phone bills over the past 7 years revealed no Scott stays in that particular residential neighborhood. Due to the absence of this critical chain, the judge once again refused to issue a warrant for a full search of Scott's private property and car, citing insufficient direct evidence. While the detectives were looking for ways to overcome the bureaucratic barriers, events were taking place within the walls of Harborview Medical Center that promised to be crucial to the solution. Jenna Roberts began to slowly emerge from a state of absolute mental numbness. Her consciousness still remained fragmented and confused, but she began to respond to the presence of the treating psychologist. During the rehabilitation sessions, which were recorded on a digital recorder, she began to utter fragmentary, quiet phrases that forced the investigators to change their plans. According to medical reports, Jenna was in a state of severe post-traumatic depression, but her memory began to return some images from a nightmare that lasted 2,560 days. She kept repeating the name of her small hometown, hundreds of miles away from Seattle, from which she had left at the beginning of her professional career. These memories of the past were accompanied by fragmentary descriptions of the man who had held her captive. Jenna whispered words that made the detectives look at old photos of Dylan Scott again and again. "I knew him. I knew him a long time ago," she repeated, staring into the emptiness of the room. In her stories, clear physical signs of the kidnapper emerged: black hair, piercing green eyes, and a specific hand pattern she saw every time she was brought food through a small window in the metal door. The detectives, in a state of so-called tunnel vision, began to mistakenly adapt this new evidence to the appearance of their prime suspect. They searched for records of Scott's tattoos, assuming that he might have gotten one between 2014 and 2021, or that he was using contact lenses or hair dye to fit the description. The investigation was so confident in the guilt of the man from the restaurant that any other version was not even considered. Even the mention of Jenna's hometown was interpreted as evidence that Scott could have been following her even before she showed up in Seattle. Lydia Simons, who waited in the hospital lobby every day for news, saw police officers constantly coming and going, full of confidence in a quick arrest. However, Jenna remained unstable, her memory often substituting the present tense for the past, and she would fall back into long periods of silence when asked specific questions about Dylan Scott. This created a dangerous illusion. The police were convinced that they were on the home stretch, not realizing that the description, black hair and green eyes, could have belonged to someone else who had known Jenna much better and for much longer than just an intrusive client. Every day under the pressure of suspicion only deepened the gap between the real truth and the investigation's version, leaving the real kidnapper in the shadows while the attention of the entire city was focused on the aggressive man in the interrogation room who, despite his unbearable behavior, could be just another false target in this intricate game of human destiny. On May 24, 2021, the investigation into Jenna Roberts entered a stage that would later be called a classic example of confirmation bias in analytical reports. The orientation formed on the basis of the victim's fragmentary and painful testimony became the main and, as it seemed at the time, irrefutable argument for finally establishing 33-year-old Dylan Scott as the main suspect. According to the notes of the attending psychologist, Jenna, in a state of extreme exhaustion, repeatedly pointed out the specific physical features of her tormentor: black hair, piercing green eyes, and a characteristic drawing on her hand that she had seen every day for 2,560 days. The major crimes detectives, blinded by Scott's aggressive behavior during previous interrogations and the discovery of the restaurant package, took this information as the final piece of the puzzle. In their opinion, the description of black hair and green eyes perfectly matched the appearance of the obsessive customer, although the color of his eyes in the documents for 2014 was defined as brown with a nutty tint. The investigation suggested that Scott might have been wearing contact lenses for 7 years, or that Jenna might have perceived colors differently due to the dim lighting in the 144-square-foot basement. The detail about the drawing on the hand, attracted the most attention. Detectives focused all available resources on finding any evidence that Dylan Scott had a tattoo on his right forearm. The surveillance officers, who were on duty at his home in 3 shifts, tried to capture any area of exposed skin of the suspect when he went out to get the mail or groceries. The archives of all the tattoo parlors in Seattle and surrounding cities within a 50-mile radius were pulled up, going back to 2013. The police were so confident that they were on the right track that they began preparations for a large-scale arrest and formal charges of kidnapping and false imprisonment. However, there was one critical detail in this perfect picture that stubbornly did not fit into Dylan Scott's life story. During every rehabilitation session, Jenna Roberts would recall with painful insistence the name of her small hometown, hundreds of miles to the south. She repeated phrases about knowing this man a long time ago, long before she moved to Seattle. The investigation examined Scott's biography to the smallest detail and found that he had never visited the town and had no family or professional ties there. Moreover, in 2013, when Jenna said she could already see her future kidnapper, Scott was continuously in Washington state, as evidenced by his tax returns and workplace reports. However, the Seattle police effectively ignored this fundamental contradiction. Official reports that week stated that the references to her hometown and old acquaintance were a manifestation of post-traumatic memory confusion in a woman who had spent 7 years in complete isolation. The detectives believed that Jenna's psyche was trying to adapt the recent trauma to images from the deep past in order to find some explanation for what had happened. One of the detectives later admitted that they perceived her words as noise that prevented them from seeing the main target. Such confidence in their own rightness led to the fact that other versions were not even considered. Lydia Simons, who sometimes received snippets of information from friends in the department, felt growing anxiety. She remembered that Jenna had indeed had a circle of friends in her youth that she had never talked about in Seattle, but the police didn't want to hear about shadows of the past when they had the aggressive and articulate Dylan Scott in front of them. The trap of similarity closed. Law enforcement spent thousands of man-hours documenting every move of a man who, although unpleasant, might have had nothing to do with a concrete basement on the outskirts of the city. Investigative teams prepared warrants, prosecutors wrote indictments, and meanwhile, the real owner of the green eyes and the tattoo on his arm continued to remain at large, perhaps not even realizing how close he was to being exposed and how easily he managed to hide behind someone else's back. Each new day spent trying to bring Scott to justice gave the real criminal time to destroy the remaining clues that could link him to the secret room where Jenna Roberts left 7 years of her life. The walls of Harborview Hospital continued to hold a secret that no one wanted to hear, while the resemblance and morbid obsession of the Silver Harbor restaurant customer satisfied justice's need for quick results. On May 26, 2021, the investigation into Jenna Roberts took an unexpected and abrupt turn that completely annulled the detectives' previous work on Dylan Scott. In order to obtain definitive, legally valid evidence of Scott's involvement in the crime, the task force contacted the administration of the Silver Harbor restaurant, located on the outskirts of Seattle. The investigation was aimed at confirming that Scott had purchased the food on May 13, 2021, in order to finally link him to the secret room in the basement, where forensic experts found a paper bag with the restaurant's logo. However, a thorough review of archived video footage from internal surveillance cameras covering the takeout area revealed that Dylan Scott had not ordered food at the restaurant that evening. The cameras recorded a completely different man entering the restaurant at 8:45 in the evening. The grainy footage clearly showed him picking up a package, paying in cash, which explained the absence of any traces of the suspect's bank transactions. After conducting in-depth identification through a national database and advanced biometric searches, Seattle police identified the man as Adam Miller, Jenna Roberts' ex-boyfriend. A report from the Department of Corrections revealed that Miller had a criminal record for a series of burglaries and had been released a few months before Jenna's disappearance in June 2014. His physical description was strikingly consistent with the description given by the victim during rehabilitation sessions at Harborview Hospital. According to the medical staff, Jenna recalled black hair, piercing green eyes, and most importantly for identification, a distinctive tattoo on her right arm in the form of a complex geometric pattern that she saw every time she was served food. In addition, Adam Miller was from the same small town in the South whose name Jenna repeated like a spell while in a state of confusion after her liberation. This finally explained her statement that she had known her kidnapper for a long time, long before she moved to Seattle. However, it was not immediately possible to track down the suspect. Adam Miller had no official King County registration address and no permanent place of employment, making him virtually invisible to standard search methods during the first days of the operation. Police conducted intensive search efforts over the next 4 days, using automatic license plate recognition systems on major Washington state highways. Several times, patrol crews spotted his old dark SUV at major interchanges outside the city, but due to heavy traffic and difficult weather conditions, the trail was lost in the traffic. It was only after an extensive check of roadside establishments and cheap hotels along Interstate 5 that Miller's car was discovered in the parking lot of a motel called the Safe Harbor on the northern outskirts. This establishment was known for accepting visitors for cash without thoroughly checking their IDs, making it an ideal hiding place for a person trying to disappear. On May 30th, 2021, at 2 in the morning, a Seattle police SWAT team launched a sting operation in Room 12. According to the officers' reports, upon entering the room, Miller put up fierce physical resistance, trying to break through the window and shouting accusations of trespassing. After he was neutralized and handcuffed, he categorically denied any connection to the events of 7 years ago, claiming that he was simply traveling the country in search of casual income and had not seen Jenna Roberts in over 8 years. However, a cell phone seized during his arrest and a visit to the Silver Harbor restaurant a few days before the basement was opened, recorded by cameras, completely shook his line of defense. A biographical connection to the victim, a shared past in his hometown, and identifying physical markings, including the same tattoo that Jenna saw every day during the 2,560 days of his detention, allowed the investigation to change Miller's status from mere suspect to prime accused. While Miller was being transported to a heavily guarded central detention center, detectives were already preparing for a detailed search of his car, hoping to find something that would finally break his false testimony and put an end to a story that had been shrouded in a thick shadow of uncertainty and false suspicions about other people for 7 years. After 37-year-old Adam Miller was arrested at a motel on the outskirts of Seattle, the County Police Crime Lab began an immediate and extremely thorough examination of his old dark SUV, which had long served as his only means of transportation. The results of the examination, officially released on June 1, 2021, were the final and indisputable proof of his guilt in committing this brutal crime. Under the rear passenger seat of the car, as well as in the deep crevices of the luggage compartment lining, forensic experts found numerous biological traces of Jenna Roberts, including samples of her blonde hair and microscopic particles of epithelium that survived despite the attackers' attempts to chemically clean the interior. Under the weight of overwhelming scientific evidence and the results of genetic analysis, Adam Miller abruptly changed his tactics of aggressive denial to a full and detailed admission of guilt. According to the official video recordings of the interrogations, which lasted more than 10 hours, he described in detail how he had been methodically planning the kidnapping since his release from prison in 2013. It turned out that Miller acted with cold, almost surgical calculation. He chose a private 2-story house on the northern outskirts of the city, precisely because he knew through his former connections in the construction industry that the owners were long absent and had moved to another state. According to the defendant, He broke the lock of the back entrance at the end of 2013 and secretly equipped the basement for the next 6 months. He brought in heavy soundproofing panels with him, installed a forced air ventilation system, and reinforced the steel door, hiding it behind a massive wooden shelving unit. Miller told detective teams that he hid traces of his daily presence from his few neighbors by parking his car several miles away and entering only at dusk through the backyard. The motive for the crime, according to Miller himself, was a painful and uncontrollable revenge for the events of 2013, when Jenna Roberts decided to break off all relations with him forever and left him in one of the most difficult periods of his life. After finding her in Seattle after 7 months of searching, he began a long campaign of psychological pressure, sending anonymous text messages with death threats. It was the last of these messages, received by Jenna on June 15, 2014, at 8:20 in the evening during dinner at the Silver Harbor restaurant, that sent her into a state of uncontrollable panic. Miller admitted that he had been waiting for her that night in the shade of trees near her apartment complex. When she turned onto a dark stretch of road with no streetlights or surveillance cameras, he intercepted her, forced her into the back of his car, and drove her to a pre-prepared 144-square-foot concrete room. There, she spent the next 2,560 days at the mercy of her captor. The trial, which began in September 2021 in Seattle District Court, was one of the most high-profile criminal trials of the decade. Based on the biological evidence presented, the detailed protocols of the basement search, and the defendant's own confessions, the court found Adam Miller guilty of first-degree kidnapping, false imprisonment, and inflicting severe physical and mental suffering. The verdict was announced in the presence of dozens of journalists: life imprisonment in a maximum security prison without any right to early release or mitigation. After the verdict was announced, Jenna Roberts began an even more difficult and exhausting process of returning to normal reality. Despite the deep psychological trauma that manifested itself in frequent panic attacks, agoraphobia, and panic fear of enclosed spaces, she was able to take the first confident steps towards recovery with the unconditional support of Lydia Simons. Lydia, who was the only person allowed to see Jenna during the first critical months of medical and psychological rehabilitation, later recalled that her friend was learning to re-perceive the world, where sunlight was no longer a source of physical pain for her eyes. For 2 years, Jenna underwent intensive therapy at a closed, specialized center for victims of prolonged isolation and violence, where specialists helped her overcome the effects of muscle atrophy and severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Subsequently, for her own safety and an overwhelming desire to start her life from scratch, she officially changed her name and moved to another state on the East Coast, where her current location is kept strictly secret by law enforcement. According to reports from social services and comments from her lawyers, the woman now works as a volunteer at a nonprofit organization that helps people who have experienced similar tragedies and prolonged imprisonment. She tries to turn her painful experience in the basement into an effective tool of psychological salvation for those who have lost hope. The private house on the northern outskirts of Seattle, where this secret prison existed for 7 years, was completely dismantled by the new owners of the site to erase any reminders of these dark events from the neighborhood's memory. The story of Jenna Roberts remained in the Seattle Police Archives as an eternal reminder that even after 2,560 days in complete darkness, the light of truth can find its way out, and justice, though years late, always has the final say in the battle against human cruelty and the shadows of the past that try to swallow the future.